Chapter 11, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 11, Demon's Bane. Part 1, Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. Under most other circumstances, Eliphas would consider what he just saw a glorious slaughter that would make Khorne happy. Well, the god of war was going to be happy regardless, the Dark Apostle concluded. He could hear the thunder of the orbital bombardment and felt the aftershocks below his feet. The Astartes could also taste the thousands upon thousands of souls torn from their mortal coil and sent screaming into the warp. Some were even happy at the prospect of what awaited them, while others howled in fury at the bloodshed denied to them. Such an unwitting sacrifice, no matter how sudden, had its uses. Some of those souls would fuel the defenses, making the rest of the peninsula that much harder to crack. Unfortunately, Eliphas was no longer certain he had the assets to grind down any assault that might come his way. Much less, then proceed to counterattack them to death after the warp gate replenished his numbers. The corpse worshippers surprised him. Even if they could find the control center for the ancient orbital platforms, and there were enough of them left operational to matter, which obviously was true, more's the pity, they shouldn't have been able to gain access and use them anytime soon. It was a very long shot. His agents could have done it, at least in theory, and only because they were led by an Astartes with access to the soul of a true believer who used to work there when alive. Loyalist and Necron forces are advancing on our positions. A deceptively calm voice hissed, "We need support if we're to hold." Explosions and screams drowned the Vox transmission. Eliphas's experienced ears could hear the exotic sounds of discharging Eldar weaponry. Who could have foreseen the corpse worshippers would ally themselves with not one, but two xeno-menaces to ruin his plans? Eliphas didn't bother to answer the request. Instead, he ran towards the nearest command post. He could see in his mind's eye a good enough map of his forces' disposition, or where they should have been, because a third to half of the warm bodies he had available couldn't be relied upon to stay put and follow any complicated orders. He could rely on his Astartes, some demons and demon engines would be of use. Several Guard and PDF units who saw the truth and turned on the Imperium would follow orders as well. The rest were rabble, little more than cannon fodder useful to screen competent units. The problem was that he just lost a significant number of the latter, and more would follow until he could organize a proper response. Get sacrifices going. I want a solid wall of demons tearing those corpse botherers to pieces. Eliphas ordered his remaining sorcerers. Those weren't among the most powerful or brightest, however, they weren't a real danger either, unless someone new had arrived recently without him noticing. Interceptors and bombers rose to blunt the attack, and Eliphas was glad that he didn't have to do everything himself. A minute later, he was much less happy when Necron's scythe-like craft met his aircraft and heavy anti-air fire rose from the advancing enemy. At least he was now in an operational command post and could see the scope of the disaster with his own eyes. The ground split into glowing fissures, infernos engulfed settlements bearing signs of the primordial truth, fusion warheads flattened villages and cracked defense lines. Lance strikes focused on any trace of resistance in the lower part of the peninsula. The warp pulsed strangely while its denizens feasted. Something powerful looked at the battlefield, and Eliphas could feel the tiniest sliver of attention from his patrons. The warp resonated with power, and he could hear chanting in his mind. With the 37 keys of Tzeentch, we open the way for our brothers. A sorcerer screamed and plunged his clawed fingers in the chest of a prisoner to tear out her still-beating heart. With the 1,000 whispers of Slanesh, we call to them. In a profaned temple to the corpse emperor, a murder orgy took place, led by the dead governor's concubine. Reality sundered and clawed demonettes burst through, joining the celebration. With the 12 plagues of Nurgle, we fell their enemies. Within a steel pen, dozens of prisoners writhed in agony, while countless diseases ravaged their bodies and withered their souls, in preparation to turn them into demon hosts. And with the mighty axe of Khorne, we cut open the world for them. Berserkers and Khornate cultists fell upon each other, spilling blood and gathering skulls for their patron. Meanwhile, a sorcerer used a ceremonial axe to behead a long line of prisoners, gleefully spilling their blood and using it as fuel. Come forth and spread the truth of chaos. Something whispered within Eliphas's mind. "Show me the warp gate," he demanded, and soon a corrupted hololith, covered in pulsing veins, came to life, displaying the gate in all its glory. Demons raced through by the scores, while world-bearer squads marched in lockstep, like on an ancient parade. It was an unending tide of warriors to drown the enemies of chaos undivided. Eliphas grinned widely at the sight, then he frowned. The pouring horde slowed down, and the screaming surface of the portal shimmered. A familiar, hated presence observed the unfolding events and expended power to defy chaos itself. To Eliphas's inhuman senses, beyond the comforting presence of his patron's energy, he could barely perceive a wave of searing golden power. It was anathema. It stood against everything he believed in. With every passing moment, it rose the price needed to bring reinforcements higher and higher. What was so important here, it would bring the corpse's attention. Whatever it was, Eliphas knew he had to deny it to the enemy. Antaeus arrived at the battle in style. He rode across the hellscape in the back of a precious land raider, surrounded by a veteran Terminator squad wielding priceless weaponry and armor. For this operation, Captain Thule pulled off all the stops and opened all the vaults on board of their battle barge. The super-heavy assault transport drove behind a spearhead of Predator tanks, followed by a guard Baneblade repaired and upgraded with the help of the Necrons. As a consequence, for a change, it wasn't the Astartes who drew most enemy attention. The countless Necron drones swarming around the battlefield, providing distraction or lethal weaponry, had something to do with that state of affairs, the librarian guessed. He had his helmet's HUD linked to the venerable machine's external cameras, and it showed him a rare apocalypse. Scarred, twisted, and bleeding soil burned, weapons of all kinds burned lines through the air, and as far as the eye could see, there were explosions beyond number. A single glance was enough to tell Antaeus that on this battlefield, only the guard units with access to sealed armor would be of any use. Everyone else would die screaming in short order, either because of radiation, toxins, plagues, or raw warp exposure. In their short time on Kronus, the traitors had turned this region into a slice of a demon world. And they were only on the outskirts of the infestation. Antaeus didn't want to think about what they would find when they pushed deeper. "Target, 12 o'clock, Demolisher," the driver announced. "I have it." The Land Raider vibrated when its heavy Lascannons spoke as one. Antaeus saw the target, a former guard vehicle profaned by now-burning chaos iconography. The corrupted machine was turning around while a group of Necron warriors repeatedly shot it in the flank, stripping large amounts of armor with every hit. It didn't manage to bring its main weapons to bear on the Xenos. A full alpha strike from the Land Raider caught it in the side and cored it, igniting ammunition and fuel. Some small drones flew into the holes and detonated, obliterating anything that might have survived the Astartes' attention. A group of deformed mutants crested a hill to the left, carrying heavy weaponry. Before they could acquire targets, a Vindicator turned them into a red mist with a long barrage reminiscent of a laser beam. A platoon of PDF Lehman Russ tanks attempted to slow down the Loyalist advance and squared off against the Land Raider and its Predator escort. That exchange of fire was over quickly and had predictable results. The enemy managed to score a single hit, which glanced off the thick frontal plate of the assault transport. The faster and nimble Astartes tanks avoided all incoming fire before shooting up the opposition. Aquila actual to all retribution elements, advance 15 more kilometers and establish a defensive perimeter. Task Force Talon is on the way to secure a forward operation base. Eldar forces will act as a screening element. Traitor artillery finally caught up with the advance, and a lucky hit threw off a track from the Predator on point. The Blood Raven tank skid to a halt and caught multiple AT missiles in the side. Traitor Astartes with heavy weaponry, Antaeus concluded. He could barely perceive their forms through the camera feed. Witchcraft cloaked them. Foul sorcery, the librarian decided and busied himself with shattering it. Part 2. Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. "We'll dine in hell." Weber threw my earlier words back in my face. He might have been sarcastic, however it was hard to tell through the distortion of his respirator. There were glowing rivers of magma in the distance, thanks to a deorbited Ares platform that hit something sensitive in the planet's crust. As a consequence, our right flank was reasonably secure for now. A brand new volcano was busy erupting over there, grounding most flights in the area and making a no-go zone for the majority of heretics. Daemons and traitor Astartes might be able to slip through, however their regular ground forces would be stymied. That was the general consensus anyway. However, 2 infantry regiments were busy digging in at the outer edge of the zone, covered by Eldar walkers and a few Necron drone swarms. The expendable little horrors had little issue going into that particular slice of hell, and mostly getting back. That covered the fire and brimstone part of the hell comparison. The army of demons massing just behind the Chaos arcane defenses accounted for another check on the list. The heretics were obviously the damned souls who begged to be purged for good. We'll have to clean up the place a bit first. I relented. This place was our first forward operational base within chaos-infested territory, a location of vital importance for multiple reasons. First, it was on a rocky plateau, offering some defensive advantages and a great position to mass regimental artillery. Second, we needed a reasonably secure logistics and repair hub. Third, this would be a processing center for wounded. Those well enough to pull back would board evacuation transports, while the poor bastards suffering any trace of corruption would either get lucky or receive the Emperor's mercy. Fourth, this would be the first field test of the Necron pylons, and so far they worked beautifully. When we arrived on the heels of blunted armored spearheads, the plateau was a slaughterhouse crawling with Necrons, murdering every single heretic who didn't have the good grace to die already or run. As soon as we arrived, the effect was spectacular, yet not precisely the one we expected. The ground, which had bleeding patches of mixed soil and flesh, writhed, screamed, and died. Unnatural growths rapidly withered and turned to ash to be carried away by the wind. Profane symbols upon wrecked vehicles and equipment burst into fire and faded away. The half-melted remains of an autocannon screeched and tried to crawl away before collapsing into twisted metal. A mutant shrieked and fell dead before a wraith could dismember it. More importantly, I could hear an angry and surprised cacophony produced by infuriated demons who clawed at the borders of reality itself and suddenly found them strengthened. The fact I could startled me. Celine's presence had kept it all away until now. I looked around, searching for the kid, who was supposed to stay at my side no matter what. She was near the front half of a traitor chimera, looking inside. "Charles, make sure Celine doesn't get away again," I told my commissar friend. He looked around as well, then rapidly made his way to her. Meanwhile, I examined the warp around us. There was the familiar void where Celine was. I could vaguely perceive the literal hell that awaited us beyond the pylon's effect. That prick Eliphas was really trying to turn Kronus into a demon world, and there were countless warp-spawned bastards gleefully trying to claim it for themselves. Despite that, the warp right around us was calm, clean, I guess. I never had experienced something like this. Those pylons, they didn't just strengthen the borders of reality. They somehow pushed away all the things infesting the immaterium, creating pockets of calm. That was the best way I could put it into words. Just standing here, being barely able to touch the immaterium, much less being able to use its energies for anything, was refreshing. With access to this, how in the Emperor's name did the Necrons lose the war in heaven? Didn't they know what they had? This was similar, yet different to what I felt under the effect of the pylon they gave us. Was it because it was an older, less refined model? Or perhaps the number of pylons active in close proximity? I was at loss for words. Celine's approaching presence restarted my brain, either that, or the lack of the sudden and unexpected sensation of peace and relaxation I experienced. The girl skipped happily to my side, or so it seemed. It was hard to be sure, with Selene covered from head to toe in sealed armor of her own. Credit where credit is due, Scipio's cogboys and girls outdid themselves. "You, young lady, are staying right beside me. Is that clear, Selena?" I demanded. The little blank looked up for a few seconds and eventually nodded. "The kid needs a minder," Charles pointed out. "Perhaps more than one. 2 minders are on the way." The Necron Lord's deep voice startled me. Ever since we arrived, he had been standing nearby, staring in the distance and presumably coordinating his forces. I was about to ask what the oversized murder bot had in mind when painfully familiar emerald lighting struck nearby. The optics of my helmet helped spare my sight. When I could see clearly again, there were two kind of short and slim Necrons standing behind Selene. They held smaller variants of the standard Gauss weapons loved by the aliens. Their heads swung around, scanning for threats. Human designation Selene, strategic status critical. We will ensure safety. One of the newcomers spoke in a typical Necron fashion. Well, they should have no problem being around her, Weber muttered. No offense meant, he hastily added when Selene turned her head to look at him. Let's carry on. We have job to do. Affirmative. The odd duo chorused in stereo. Commissar, please check when the field HQ will be operational and ensure that the tech priests have everything they might need to expedite construction. Charles saluted and promptly left. The rest of my bodyguard detail were less fortunate. I didn't need my Psyker abilities, or any training for that matter, to see that Corporal Santos and his stormtrooper buddies were on edge, and not just because of our location. The Ogrins, on the other hand, nonchalantly quietly talked to each other, and while sharp and alert for threats, didn't show any visible unease from either Selene or the Necrons, bless their simple souls. The enemy is preparing to hit us hard before we can fortify this position, the Necron Lord announced. He swiped clawed fingers through the air and a clear hologram appeared in front of us. It showed tall, twisted altars pulsing with warp energy and surrounded by large pools of blood. Just beyond them, I could see a thick mass of purple, grey and red flesh, all kinds of appendages that had no place upon humanoid bodies and ravenous maws filled with razor-sharp teeth. That's a lot of demons. And every single one of them wanted to skull-fuck us while eating our guts. Or much worse, the image changed, showing 3 armored columns, 2 made of traitor PDF and guard units, with the third, waiting further back, consisting of traitor Astartes and demon engines. There was at least a company worth of those never sufficiently damned bastards ready to slam into our lines at the first sign of weakness. Warp distortions and arcane defenses meant that indirect fire was all but useless. We confirmed that after half an hour bombardment that failed to hit anything important or break through the sorcery. Watch. The Necron focused my attention on a new image. We were looking at the twisted altars which pulsed with energy from top to bottom, then discharged it in a wide circular waves. Unless sufficiently powerful blank or potentially protected by a pylon, anyone alive caught in such a blast would have their soul torn from its mortal coil and thrown into the warp with predictable results. Traitor artillery thundered, and the horde of ravenous demons charged past the altars. Now it begins, the Necron declared. He sounded almost happy, and soon I figured out why. Chapter 11. Parts 3 Man 4. Chapter 11. Demon's Bane. Part 3. Deimos Peninsula. Kronus. It was a rare and terrible occasion when the legions of Khorne needed to fight with forethought, much rarer that they cared for it. It was rarer still they were ordered to pursue an agenda besides slaughtering everything in their path. Today was such a terrible day. Ujul was among the last demon to fight his way through the warp and a searing barrier of golden power. His great war steed stumbled and bellowed in pained fury. Smoke rose from Kultiran's armored hide. The tough flesh refused to seal back together until the foreign power still clung to it and burned. Ujul fared a little better. His armored, skull-covered coat took the brunt of the anathema's wrath. The golden light still seared his face and hands nearly to the bone. The Herald of Khorne smiled anyway. The anathema's power wasn't enough to deny him passage. In exchange for what he just suffered, he would reap troves of mighty skulls. But even that was secondary. Today the Skull-Taker was going to make a point. Chaos could not be denied. Khorne's will could never be denied. There would be an everlasting war. Rivers of blood would drown the galaxy, and mountains of skulls would fight for the privilege to adorn Khorne's throne. Where schemes and arrogance failed, might, blood, and skill would carry the day. Thus Khorne ordained, and thus Uzul would make it be. Kultiran trampled lesser demons who had the temerity to find themselves in their way. He feasted on a few of them, using their energy to hasten his healing, and the Skull-Taker approved. He rode past Eliphaz the Dark Apostle and sneered at the failure. One day he would take the fool's skull and throw it away as the unworthy trash it was. Soon Ujul reached the pathetic excuse of a battlefield he had to reshape. Not even a full legion of demons, all but a handful of weak examples of their kind, was all he had to work with. The herald was beginning to understand why Khorne sent him here. He could see the enemy, and most of them weren't worthy of his time, much less his blade. The Skull-Taker beheld the soulless machines with worthless skulls. He experienced the void that was actually mildly dangerous. He could feel a nasty patch of the warp around it. It was twisted into a disgusting, abominable mockery of all that a demon of Khorne stood for. Kultiran roared in shared fury, and thousands of throats answered. The demons now knew he was here. Every single bloodletter went wild, as they should. Ujul was what they wanted to be, the pinnacle of his kind, and today he was going to prove it once again. The Herald of Khorne drew his hungry hellblade, pointed at the enemy, and went to war. The Necron Lord of Kronus watched a horde of abominations approach. He beheld the greatest atrocity wrought by the ancient enemy, at the offense against reality itself. The Necron Lord decided that he hated every single one of the abominations with a burning passion. That revelation surprised him and gave him a brief pause to re-examine his mental state. In less than a second, countless safety routines and scans ran their course, and what they revealed did indeed stun him for another second. Meanwhile, his warriors and human allies wasted no time. Without waiting for orders, they opened fire at the advancing forces of insanity. Emergency subroutines locked down parts of the Necron Lord's mind, forcing down the stunned confusion he briefly experienced. This revelation could wait, no matter how important it might be. The human artillery was somewhat effective in the killing ground between the trans-dimensional defenses erected by the servants of the abominations and the Alliance's defense perimeter. Human solid projectile fixed defenses and crew-operated weapon emplacement opened fire next, followed by hastily dug-in vehicles. Meanwhile, the Necron drone swarms and destroyers opened fire to intercept a powerful and sustained enemy artillery barrage. The darkened sky lit up with explosions, clearly illuminating the battlefield. As expected, human, Eldar, and even Necron long-range firepower were less effective than desired against this type of abominations. And as accounted for, the enemy armor would advance after the next pulse of their profane defensive towers. However, those were conventional threats which had many available answers. The approaching horde was something else, especially several powerful emanations that used the rest as shields to get close. Bolts of trans-dimensional energy rained upon the defenders. Abominations ran towards them, shrugging off enough firepower to down a heavily armored vehicle. The Necron Lord opened his connection to the power generators at his base and the powerful capacitors they fed. The monolith anchoring the left flank of the defense perimeter lit up with energy. Advanced sensors swept the surrounding area, brute-forcing their way through trans-dimensional distortions. He designated coordinates and opened the floodgates. Massive pillars of energy breached the gap in time and distance between the Necron stronghold and the battlefield in front of him. The whole front lit up with emerald lighting. The first rows of abominations disintegrated. Their destruction formed a barrier that protected the rest from the backslash. The charging horde briefly faltered. Swarms of hunter drones slammed into them and detonated, adding to the confusion. Impossible energies and effects turned an army-shattering blow into mere confusion. What should have been killing blows caused mild to moderate wounds that quickly began to close. It didn't matter. The abominations slowed down, and now they had a near-solid wall of Necron warriors waiting to receive their charge. The Necron Lord's Guard was finally awake, hale, and ready for battle. The Lich Guard stood tall and defiant, wielding war scythes and thick shields. Behind every single one of them stood a phalanx of warriors equipped for close combat. For the second time that day, the Necron Lord drank deeply from the power well at his base and teleported between two of his ancient companions. To his shame, his damaged databases couldn't recall their names or most of their history together. Nevertheless, he could recall many images of them fighting together on countless battlefields, from the beginning of the war in heaven to its bitter end. The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder, right in the path of a large, angry abomination that rode an even huger monstrosity. This one would do, the Necron Lord decided. Ujul had to reconsider. There might be a handful of worthy metal skulls to take after all. One of his primary targets dared show itself, and he was going to ensure it wouldn't survive to offend Khorne again. He screamed a challenge and spurred Kul Tiran onward. The large Necron pointed an open palm their way and shot a beam of green energy straight at them. Kul Tiran plowed straight through it, screaming in pain and fury. His armored hide burst into fire and burned away. Flesh stronger than steel burned slowly but surely until the Necron attack hit bone and halted, kept at bay by the sheer power and bloody-minded determination of the demon. Kul Tiran wouldn't be denied so easy, neither would Ujul. Explosions rippled all around the Herald of Khorne. They scattered lesser demons and even sent some weaklings back to the warp before their talon could spill blood. The rest staggered, got to their feet, and resumed their charge. Blood for the Blood God! Ujul roared furiously. He hated those soulless, bloodless machines with a blinding passion. Blood! At least 1,000 demons screamed back, and they fell upon the enemy like an avalanche of hellblades, teeth and claws. They were the fury of the warp itself, and nothing could stop them. Part 4. Deimos Peninsula. Kronus. Crude mortal artillery and energy attacks flew above the battlefield and slammed into the closest nasty green pylon. Sorcery and pure warp attacks followed, concentrated on the single real danger Chaos faced on Kronus. Moments before Ujul was about to trample his first target, a pylon blew up, and the walls keeping the warp at bay weakened. Lightning thundered, and Kul Tiran suddenly stumbled, falling on his front paws just before they could smash through the Necrons. Ujul felt a barrier fall, pushing the warp away and draining his energy. As if that wasn't bad enough, the closest source of warp he could grasp was anything but invigorating. It contained no fury and rage, no echoes of slaughter or screaming souls. It was like a poison to his very existence, and he recoiled at its very touch. This was the reason why Khorne himself sent him here. He had to eradicate this unnatural phenomenon and take the skulls of those who brought something so despicable into existence. The Necron Lord lashed at Kul Tiran again, and this time his two guards followed suit. They lowered their weapons at the great war steed and unleashed emerald lighting to ravage the mighty demon. Ujul had no choice and vaulted out of his seat. Kul Tiran roared in pain and fury and got up to gore the despicable machines. Emerald beams, ugly things, not like the more bearable Nurgle poisons, cut its feet from under him. Demon flesh yielded, and this time Kul Tiran couldn't get enough warp energy fast enough to heal, much less shrug off the wounds. The Skulltaker came to the rescue, followed by hundreds of bloodletters. They slammed into the Necron lines with a vengeance. Hellblade and claws met war scythes, hyperphase swords, and tough necrodermis. Necrons fell, but so did demons. Massed artillery struck their rear ranks, drones suicided among their numbers, and the Imperials poured as much fire into the demons as they could from their elevated positions. Demons vanished, banished, screaming back into the warp much faster than it should have been possible. It didn't matter. Ujul could instinctively read the battlefield. There weren't enough Necrons to stop them, and Eliphas would be useful for once. The armored columns were on the way, and very soon the enemy would have to shoot at them. Besides, all that didn't matter right now. The Skulltaker had his target where he wanted it. Ujul roared furiously and slammed into the Necron Lord and pushed it back. The fury of the warp clashed with Necron trickery. The world slowed down to a crawl while four warriors did their best to tear each other to pieces. It was glorious. If Antaeus was a lesser man, his blood would freeze in his veins as soon as the demon attack began. He could recognize the warp abomination leading the charge. It was Ujul, the Skulltaker. That thing was an alpha-class threat at best, one not to be engaged without a strong Grey Knight contingent and powerful anti-demon countermeasures available. There were no Grey Knights on Kronus. However, there were various anti-warp and demon options available. Antaeus only hoped they would be enough. "Brothers with me!" The librarian's voice rattled the Land Raider. "Drive straight at that monster!" Antaeus spared a brief moment to check the tactical feed and grimaced. He could see the Inquisitor, his blank ward, and bodyguards heading into the fray. Antaeus knew the plan, and this was precisely the wrong time and target to try it on. The Skull-Taker was here, and it would be all they could do to survive the day. Raven 5 to all elements on this net, designating priority target, Alpha-class threat. Concentrate all available firepower on it. Do not approach without heavy anti-warp protection. The Land Raider's engine roared to life, and the assault transport ploughed through its dug position to charge down the slope of the plateau. The Terminators inside chanted prayers and litanies of protection. While Antaeus glared at the camera feed, he could see the Inquisitor and his security detail expose themselves and charge straight to where the Xenos fought and slowly lost against the demon horde. This time, that fool was going to get himself killed for sure. Lascannons and heavy bolters firing thrice-blessed rounds lashed at the demons. Numerous explosions shook the horde and scattered portion of it, giving a brief respite to the Xenos. Raven actual to all assault squads, form on me, we're going in. Captain Thul's voice came through the battle net. There were about 30 assault marines available. Even with the captain himself leading them, it wouldn't be enough. To make things worse, the traitor's armor was on the move. They couldn't let the demons reach their hasty set-up defense line. Doing so would invite disaster. Terminators and dreadnoughts, advance, the captain ordered. The assault squads naturally reacted faster, and soon all of them jumped from the top of the plateau into the bloodbath below. 5 venerable ancients advanced as a single unit, liberally dispensing blessed ammunition from their assault cannons. Behind them slowly advanced a Terminator squad, outfitted for long-range engagement. The Inquisitor's party drove on after them, with the madman himself and the Blank Kid riding on top of a command chimera. A swarm of Necron drones circled them, intercepting incoming enemy firepower. A group of Necron destroyers left their positions to act as a flank guard. Their heavy weapons blasted apart incoming artillery heading their way. It wasn't nearly enough. The odd warp blast sent by the demons went through, only to harmlessly dissipate when it went anywhere near the Inquisitor. This was sheer madness, and it was working. "Get us down there now," Antaeus demanded. Technically speaking, it has been a very long time since the Necron Lord of Kronus faced warp-spawned abominations. However, after the long sleep, it didn't feel that way. He could recall bits and pieces of the final battles when reality itself shattered. That allowed monsters from another dimension to arrive so they could devour everyone. This was no different. However, this time, he might just have a way to vanquish them for good. Such an opportunity was worth risking everything. The Necron Lord faced the strongest abomination on the battlefield. If he was alone, he would have lost. That much became certain almost immediately. Even with its connection to its dimension of origin, weakened by the pylons, that thing was impossibly fast and powerful. Its profane blade was extremely dangerous, and it wielded it with a skill that no living being should possess. It took the efforts of 3 Necrons to barely keep it at bay. They only managed to do so by slowly falling back, while under the effect of a chronometron. That thing was so fast that only the artifact allowed them to keep up, if barely. The Necron Lord didn't know the name of the abomination he faced. He didn't care to learn it. What mattered was it was extremely powerful. The pylons and his shadow Ankh weakened it, yet it still outclassed 3 of the best warriors he had ever known. This was better than anticipated, or would be as long as the plan worked. The Necron line buckled, then briefly stabilized when artillery bombardment and hunter drones slammed into the demons, buying a few precious moments. Human anti-abomination weaponry took its toll, and the allied enhanced warriors joined the fray, using crude rocket packs to slam into the beasts. The line didn't break. It held, if barely, however, it bent in the center, where the Necron Lord had to fall back. The frenzied abominations made another push, and the large beast, the one he fought, rode to the battlefield staggered into the fray as well. It was slow, wounded, yet it came anyway. There was a purpose behind the mad attack. The abominations did their best to separate him from support and make him an easier target. How predictable! Another pylon fell prey to concentrated attack from trans-dimensional energy and what appeared to be every single long-range weaponry the enemy had. The barriers holding reality itself together weakened, and the abominations attacked with redoubled vigor. The quadrupedal beast trampled a lich guard and got gutted in the process, staggering with a hyperphase sword sticking from its belly. The Necron vanished, whiskered away to safety for repair, just like instead of dying for good, the abominations merely returned home. That was a significant advantage the Necron had tried to deny them since the last days of the war in heaven. It was time to see if they would finally succeed. For a third time that day, the Necron Lord drank deeply from the reserves of power gathered in his stronghold. A mental command had his companions break off to slow down the tide of lesser abominations while he fell back faster. This emboldened the monster facing him, and it swung even faster and harder at him. The Necron Lord could no longer stop all attacks coming his way, much less find the time and space to counterattack. The burning blade struck him again and again, leaving rends into his tough plaiting. The damage was superficial, yet it grew with each successful strike. A small-scale human counterattack ensured that the line held for a bit longer, leaving the Necron Lord and his opponent fighting alone. The Inquisitor arrived then, with the pariah child at his side and numerous mortal guards on their heels. Instead of feeling threatened, the abomination laughed in glee and screamed some nonsense in ugly language. Chapter 11, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 11, Demon's Bane, Part 5, Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. Ujul's task just became much easier. His second primary target decided to come out and meet him openly. That was good. Great even. The bloodletter laughed. It was time to end this, and he could enjoy himself later. Kultiran, hanker to me. Give me your strength, the Skull-Taker demanded. The bond he had with his war steed pulsed once, and he drank deeply from it. It would take at least a century before Kultiran could manifest again in the materium, but that didn't matter. Here and now, he would ensure victory. Demonic flesh unraveled in a vortex of warp energy that strengthened the nearby demons. The remaining pylons pushed away some of it. However, Ujul managed to consume more than enough. It was easy, really. This time around, he didn't have to fight against the barriers to touch the warp energy. 100 empowered bloodletters swarmed over the Necron line and tore a breach into it. Human dreadnoughts and Terminator poured fire into the breach, followed by the guards of the second target. Demons fell blasted to bloody chunks and vanished, only for more to take their place. The breach widened, and yet another pylon went down. Chaos-aligned mortals finally began their assault, and a lot of the firepower directed at the diminished number of demons had shift targets. This was it. The victory was at hand. Ujul could draw on a bit more power from the warp, and he put it to good use. The Herald of Khorne fell upon the Necron world like the judgment of his bloodthirsty god. And with every swing, he tore away chunks of metal flesh. The only thing that could have made this better would have been blood and screams of pain. Instead, the doomed Necron fought on silently. No matter, the end was night. From where I stood, the plan looked less than clever. There were demons in front of us, pouring through the broken Necron line. More of the bastards did their best to overwhelm the line on the flanks. If they succeeded, they could swarm our positions en masse. Suddenly, it looked very lonely out here, between our hastily dug-in forces and the enemies of humanity. When in doubt, attack. That thought came unbidden, and it wasn't like I had a better idea. In the Emperor's name, at them, purge the demons! I screamed as loud as I could and brandished my brand-new power mace, courtesy of a traditionalist cogboy who no longer needed it. For the Emperor! For the Inquisitor! My dumb Ogrin chorused, and heedless of the danger charged straight at the rampaging demons. The Neverborn did their best to swarm over a small group of Terminators and Dreadnoughts, who made a stand near the breach and did their best to stop the monsters. Driver, charge the big demon! I snapped and pointed a tweaked las pistol at the giant ugly bastard, making a decent effort at dismembering the Necron Lord. If he fell, we were fucked. A litany of curses and prayers came from the chimera below me. Despite that, its engine roared, and with a lurch, we headed straight at the skirmish. All around us, I beheld carnage. Groups of Necron warriors flashed into existence around us. However, they could barely slow down the demons. Our heavier support was busy intercepting enemy artillery heading our way, or had to engage the leading elements of the traitor's armored columns. At least the flanks held thanks to the two Necron monoliths. Unfortunately, they could scarcely spare any firepower for the center, and it was here where this battle would be decided. My Ogrins blasted apart the first group of demons that came at them. Large-bore automatic shotguns and blessed ammunition proved their worth. Unfortunately, more demons came, and good men's blood flowed freely. I had no more time to watch the carnage because we were there. I saw the Necron Lord fall, skewered by the huge demon he fought. The monster pulled out its hellblade from his chest, dragging half-melted equipment out, and raised a hand for a decapitating strike. The remote-operated heavy bolter in front of me opened up, peppering up the demon with blessed rounds. A burst caught it in its hand, making it flinch. The hellblade fell anyway. It sliced clean through the Necron's neck at an angle that brought it down into his chest. A backhand strike sent the mangled Necron flying, and the demon ran at us almost faster than the eye could follow. A blinding streak of fire caught the demon in the side before it could carve up the chimera, and the next thing I knew, we rammed it. I was tumbling through the air next, right beside the monster who had lost its footing. I hit the ground hard, felt something break, and saw stars. The next thing I knew, Weber stood above me, screaming defiance. Blood sprayed from his left shoulder, his arm was gone, yet his trembling left hand still held a roaring chainsword. The huge demon was back. It was scorched. I could see bolter rounds detonating against its back, but it didn't care. It swung once and Charles fell to his knees. My friend's sword flew away along with a few fingers. At that point, I didn't think. I couldn't touch the warp to fling something at that monster. I couldn't find my weapons. All I could do was to stumble on my shaky legs and push Charles away. The hellblade fell and I screamed in agony. The blow brought me to my knees, leaving me helpless in front of the demon. I was barely aware that my right arm was gone, cut off at the shoulder. The hellblade rose again, and I knew I was dead. When a third pylon went down, it was a mixed blessing for Antaeus. The librarian and his assault Terminator brothers were outside, running beside the Land Raider. He was right, the Inquisitor was going to get himself killed, and there was no one close enough to save him. The Ogrins were engaged, fighting and losing against a swarm of particularly nasty bloodletters. The guard bodyguards simply lacked the firepower to even distract the Skulltaker, who easily shrugged off bolter fire and even survived a direct Lascanon strike. Antaeus was there, however, and he could draw just enough energy from the warp for a single technique. He focused on his gift, fed power through his psychic hood, and tasted both the chaos corruption of the warp and the shrinking clean zone created by the pylons. The librarian charged, twisting the laws of physics to get there in time. He arrived with his power hammer posed to strike and swung down, catching the Skulltaker in the shoulder. The strike staggered the beast. Demon flesh burned, split and spluttered. The hellblade posed to decapitate Vale barely missed the Inquisitor's head. Antaeus wasted no time and bodily checked the demon, then did his best to push him aside and buy time. He got backhanded for his trouble with enough strength to stagger him. The hellblade flashed his way, and Antaeus instinctively caught it on the thick shaft of his hammer. The blessed metal alloy spluttered in defiance, smoked but held. A bloodletter appeared from behind the Skulltaker, just as Antaeus barely parried a thrust aimed at his eyes. The second demon tackled him and began clawing and snapping at him. Antaeus pushed the haft of his hammer into its ravenous mouth and tried to get it off. While his armor kept the damage to a minimum, he was unable to help the Inquisitor or save himself. The librarian was sure he would be losing his head next. Part 6. Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. It all came down to contingency planning in the end, and the human Inquisitor risking his own life. Otherwise, the Necron Lord doubted that his phylactery would have had enough time to knit together his mangled body. He underestimated this particular abomination, a lesson he might just survive to learn from. It cut through the guards of the pariah child with contemptuous ease, then mangled one of the Inquisitor's closest companion, only for the human to throw himself in peril, just as he did to save the Necron Lord. All he could do was wait and give orders. The outcome of the whole battle hung on a blade's edge. He needed just a few more moments, and the Inquisitor's other companion, Antaeus, bought those precious moments. The repair machines fixed him enough to activate his resurrection orb, which not only hastened his own repair, but brought together the Necron warriors fallen nearby. Lighting arced over their corner of the battlefield, and fallen Necrons knit back together, then rose to continue the battle. The two guards scampered up, back together again, grabbed their blades and charged the abomination. Even as it took 2 blows in order to dismember one of its attackers, the Necron Lord could see it was tiring, slowing down. The pylons and the nearby pariah had an effect, just not enough of it yet. It was time, his trump card was finally ready. Back at his stronghold, thousands of scarabs worked tirelessly to modify the next monolith to come fully online. They were busy incorporating state-of-the-art pylons within its systems, protected by thick slabs of necrodermis, active and passive defenses. It was finally fully operational and ready for deployment. The capacitors at the stronghold dumped all the energy they had in one monstrous torrent. A mountain-sized bolt of lighting twisted time and space until 2 distant points became one. All that energy manifested right in front of an enemy armored column, which was just beginning to spread out into an assault formation. Everything nearby ceased to exist. Those looking at the event with unprotected eyes went blind. The resulting shockwave and deafening thunderclap brought a brief pause into the fighting. The Necron Lord staggered to his feet, and he would have smiled if he could. As soon as the new pylon was in position and working, he removed the safeties of the remaining ones, supercharging them. The effect was immediate and profound. A full third of the remaining abominations found themselves caught by the strongest part of the field. Every single one of them, including the large one, recoiled. Some of them burst into white flame where they stood, probably the weaker ones. It was high time to put their immortality to test. The abomination had enough strength left to stab the Necron it fought in the chest, then nearly punched the warrior's head off. Fortunately, doing so too its toll. Meanwhile, the red-armored human managed to dispatch the weakened abomination on top of him and got up just in time to intercept a mortal blow aimed at the severely wounded Inquisitor. A few stumbling abominations tried to intercept the still struggling to walk Necron Lord, who dispatched them with his gauntlet of fire. As soon as he struck them down, they too burst into white flames, screaming in agony. That was a good sign, surely. Adrenaline and sheer desperation kept me somewhat coherent. Antaeus briefly suspended my death sentence, then 2 more Necrons jumped at the demon. I was properly hallucinating, or it might have been wishful thinking. Nevertheless, it looked like the demon was weakening and slowing down. It still managed to cut down the Necrons and was about to finish me when Antaeus came to the rescue again. They clashed again, and this time my librarian friend could hold his own. I would have cheered if I could. Instead, I rasped in pain. I could feel myself weakening by the heartbeat, and it finally dawned to me that I must do something about my missing arm. My left hand went for the med pack I was sure I carried when a small lithe form dashing towards us caught my attention, and the world froze. Celine appeared all right, even if her sealed armor was a bit banged up and dirty. She carried my power mace and a few times nearly stumbled over its weight, yet she persisted with bloody-minded determination and beelined towards the demon. Antaeus was still fighting it, and both of them appeared worse to wear now. I cursed and didn't care I was rapidly bleeding out. I looked around for a weapon and saw one of the Necrons nearby. It was cut nearly in 2, yet it struggled to reach its sword. I stumbled forward and grabbed the weapon's hilt, which neatly fit in my arm. "Celine, stay back," I slurred out and stumbled towards the battle. "Vale, back off," Antaeus shouted, and it cost him. The demon slipped his blade through his guard and stabbed him under the right shoulder. That effort proved too much, and the Neverborn fell to his knees. It bled profusely, bolters blew off chunks of its corrupted flesh, which soon burst into silver flames. Yet it refused to die. The demon surged up with furious roar and pushed Heblade in, nearly severing Antaeus's arm. A streak of fire struck it into the side and made him stumble away from the librarian. Some of its wounds caught fire, which began to slowly spread. It still refused to die. Antaeus fell to one knee, his right arm hanging limp. He grabbed the shaft of his hammer near the head and lunged at the demon. The monster twisted with unexpected burst of speed, and instead of smashing its skull in, Antaeus landed a glancing blow that took off half its face and stumbled past it. The daemon wasted no time, and with the last strength it had left, charged at me. Bolters staggered it. A second lance of fire struck him in the back and ignited it properly this time, yet it kept coming. Selene was there then. She swung the power mace wildly and caught the demon in the kneecap. It imploded, finally bringing it down in front of me as I staggered towards it, swinging blindly. My blade found purchase, and the world ended in soothing silver fire. Chapter 11. Part 7. Chapter 11. Demon's Bane. Interlude. A Quiet Death. The Warp. Ujul, the Skull-Taker, most honored herald of Khorne, died quietly. In fact, almost no one noticed the precise moment of his passing. The reason was simple. The warp surrounding Kronus was chock-full with ravenous demons tearing at the borders of reality itself. Their screams of fury and pain drowned everything else. A thin barrier of anathema's light stood firm, extracting a price of anything that attempted to manifest on Kronus. It further weakened and drained every lesser demon that had the misfortune to be banished, which led to short-lived fights and feeding frenzies. Nevertheless, chaos was winning. The barriers separating materium and immaterium gradually weakened. More demons passed through the warp gate, even though they had to burn a lot of power for the privilege. Those already on the other side grew gradually stronger and bolder. His victory was at hand, and then the impossible happened. Chaos was denied its due. In a single moment, something banished hundreds of screaming demons back into the warp. A very short-lived stunned shock ensured before the warp descended into a feeding frenzy. In the ensuing anarchy, the feasting demons didn't know or care that much less food came back weakened for the taking. Many a demon had expended too much energy fighting against Necron anti-warp technology. Then they expended more in actual combat and to heal wounds that would have slain a living creature. The weakest of them simply didn't have enough power left to cross back into the warp and survive passing through the anathema's barrier. They burned, their remaining energies purified and consumed. The same happened to a smaller number of the weakest lesser demons caught in the Necron trap. Their essence scattered and could only reach the zones of purified warp created by the pylons. There it was slowly cleansed, obliterating those demons for good. Ujul suffered a similar fate. He found himself caught in a potent anti-warp field and the presence of a pariah. He had bled a tremendous amount of energy by that point and was unable to properly replenish it. A different demon might have noticed the danger and ran. The Skull-Taker was made from a tougher cloth. He had his targets in front of him. The victory was at hand, and he was the herald of Khorne. He didn't run. He fought and he won. Ujul fought to the last. It was glorious combat, and he gave it his all. Yet, victory has slipped his grasp, and his determination doomed him in the end. His unnatural flesh burned, his energy ended up scattered or absorbed by a ravenous pariah, with what little was left slamming head first into the anathema's barrier where it burst into silver flame. Ujul, the herald of Khorne, the Skull-Taker, was no more. His very essence was gone, destroyed, transformed or purified. When Khorne beheld the destruction of his honored servant, he was silent for a moment that lasted for an eternity. And when it came, his wrath was legendary. The warp shook from his fury, scattering lesser demons to the four winds. Against that boundless fury, the Astronomicon glowed brighter, spreading waves of searing golden fire across the galaxy. Bridge rogue trader vessel, Luca Fodis. The warp en route to Kronus. Your ship shaking during warp travel was never a good sign. The vibrations became worse and worse the closer they got to their destination. For days now, Inquisitor Vale had her retinue outfitted for heavy combat, which unfortunately wasn't their specialty. It was a good thing they had a mechanized infantry regiment embarked. The guardsmen, along with most of the crew, were spread throughout the ship, watching intently for any incursion. Amberley had her retinue divided between main engineering, the Geller field generator in particular, and the bridge. They had to change navigators for a third time today. The strain of finding a way past the hordes of demons converging on Kronus was becoming extreme. Fortunately, thanks to acting as her transport, the Luca Foedis enjoyed ample resources in all categories. In this particular case, paying from her pocket for additional navigators, was an extremely useful investment, which paid for itself through survival. The senior navigator stumbled from his alcove to be replaced by a much younger and fitter woman. Disturbingly, he bled from his 3 eyes, yet has had a smile on his face. Amberly's hand quickly went for a weapon, and she was ready to draw at a moment's notice. The naval armsman on the bridge did the same. "The Emperor's light, it's beautiful," the navigator gushed. "He on Terra is protecting Kronus. I could see his shield, its divinity made manifest." A shockwave hit the ship and threw everyone not secured off their feet. Only Amberly's power armor and the magnetic clamps holding her to the deck saved her from breaking something, perhaps even her neck. The navigator stumbled into a console and hit it hard. He screamed and fell to the ground, carefully holding a broken arm. Status report. Geller field down to 41% and climbing. No breaches detected. Multiple casualties. All decks. One of the navigators screamed and their alcove burst open, spilling a fountain of blood, though no demon jumped out. There was just smoking blood and gore. "We lost 2 navigators. Pressure on the Geller field is lessening." Whatever happened pushed us closer to our target. Estimated time of arrival in system, 27 hours. "And 51 hours to reach orbit afterward," Amberly muttered. She was almost afraid to find out what waited for her at their destination. Part 7. Deimos Peninsula, Kronus. The humans were utterly insane, and the Necrons. Those murderous machines were more dangerous than the stories Rohan had heard. He knew this mission would be dangerous, and it might risk the very souls of all Eldari under his command. All his expectations fell much shorter than reality, unfortunately. In this place, the walls separating reality from the Sea of Souls were particularly thin. Thin enough that any Eldari with meaningful psychic gift would be keenly aware of all the demons clawing at those thin barriers. The twisted servants of She Who Thirsts were present, both on the surface of Kronus and in the Sea of Souls in great numbers, and all they wanted was Eldari souls to devour and torture for eternity. A less desperate commander would have ordered a retreat, leaving the humans and their allies to fight alone. Rohan didn't dare even think much about such a possibility. He didn't want to know what kind of alliance might be forged from such a cataclysm, much less see it unleashed upon his people. The Ranger had to re-evaluate the magnitude of the disaster his sister unleashed on Kronus. He wanted to believe this was a one-off, an outlier that couldn't happen again. Either the humans or Necrons would surely see to it. Yet the alliance didn't fall apart. On the contrary, it was working rather well, all things considered. Too well, in fact, and now the situation deteriorated further. A veil of golden power fell upon the whole planet. Almost every Eldari could recognize it. It was the same kind of power that illuminated a large part of the galaxy for the past 10,000 years. The human emperor. Kronus had his attention. The Alliance had his attention, and Rohan didn't dare think it might have held disapproval. He silently cursed Taldir for causing this, and then Eldrad for good measure for sending him here. At that point, a horde of demonettes crawled out of the smoke, followed by noise marines flying on crude contraptions. Enemy forces in range, weapons free, Rohan bitterly ordered, rueing the need to spend good Eldari lives and endanger souls. He aimed with his sniper rifle and gently caressed the trigger. A daemonette's head snapped up, its back missing from the shot. Grav tanks unleashed their fury, blowing large craters within the volcanic hell. The Necron drones found targets and descended, ramming demonettes and corrupted humans alike. At the same time, the main enemy host began its attack upon the combined human and Necron forces, who soon played their trick, shaking every Eldari in range to the bone. The thin walls between reality and the Sea of Souls suddenly strengthened, which was good, great even. The acute appearance of pristine, clean and peaceful patches within the Sea of Souls, which remained untouched by the Neverborn, was like a serene song. Whatever the insane humans and their allies did stunned him. For the first time since he could recall, the monstrous and malign presence of She Who Thirsts was nothing more than a distant whisper he could barely perceive. For a moment, Rohan could almost imagine that the Eldari's greatest folly couldn't touch him. A lance of coherent light ravaged the hill he hid on, rattling him out of the daze. Rohan slapped the side of his helmet and shook his head in an attempt to clear his mind. Looking around, he could see his soldiers were affected as well. Most had ceased firing, including many grav tanks, which merely floated listlessly. Only the walkers appeared unaffected, and they kept shooting at the advancing Neverborn. "Eldari," Rohan screamed, "fight! Fight for Ulthwé! Fight for your families! Fight for your souls! Don't let those wretches claim you!" More and more Guardians shook off their stupor and rejoined the battle. One after another, the tank crews found their senses and unleashed their fury upon the advanced demons. Rohan kept firing in a frenzy, hating those who brought the fall of the Eldari Empire and caused the birth of Hushi thirsts more than he could put into words. For the first time in his life, he had a taste of what his people lost in the fall, and it was staggering beyond belief. There were demons everywhere. Thanks to the Emperor, they were only bloodletters and other lesser abominations. Otherwise, Captain Thule and his blood ravens would have been dead already. It was a very close call anyway. All he could do was fight. Parry, slash and tear with his lighting claws, then jump up to avoid being swarmed before landing into another group of the monsters. The demons were weaker than they should have been. While their hellblades were as dangerous as ever, almost all bloodletters Thule engaged moved slower than they should have. There was less strength behind their strength than it should have. Their unnatural flesh split easier than experience told him it should. The Inquisitor's latest scheme was working, better than expected, perhaps disastrously so. The Skull-Taker was on the field. Weakened or not, there were too many demons between that monster and Captain Thule. He had to trust the Inquisitor, Antaeus, and the Xeno, because disengaging in order to seek that particular abomination would be disastrous. This battle might very well decide the whole campaign. If they could establish and hold a foothold in the region without suffering crippling losses, then they could win. A catastrophic setback here might doom them all. All the captain could do was fight with desperate fury and pray. He tore apart countless demons, yet for every single abomination he banished, at least one more came to take its place. The line was breaking, his allies couldn't halt the Skull-Taker, and he was stuck dealing with this chaff. "Blood ravens, to me!" Thule roared as he decapitated a screeching demon. "Hold the line!" The captain jumped again and had to twist in mid-air to avoid dozens of descending Necron drones. The suicidal machines rammed demons and detonated, throwing away mangled bodies, which soon got back up, wounded but still dangerous. He saw the line break, saw the Inquisitor's retinue charge at the Skull-Taker in the distance. Invigorated demons surged forth, ensuring no help would reach the beleaguered defenders. The Blood Raven slammed into a bloodletter, pulping it under his bulk, and tore its skull in two with a swipe of his right claws while catching a sword aimed at his neck with the other. A riposte eviscerated a demon, then two more red abominations were on him. Those two were much faster and stronger than the bloodletters he has faced so far. They pushed him back, and the captain found himself fighting among a cluster of Necron warriors who stubbornly held their ground against overwhelming numbers. Thule parried two hellblades trying to gut him and caught a glimpse of a black sword passing above his head to cave in the slobbering face of a demon. He used the opportunity to cut the other bloodletter in two, and only then it registered that a Xeno just saved his life. For a few endless minutes, Captain Thule had to fight back to back with a shrinking group of Necrons while demons did their best to overrun them. His world shrunk to his lighting claws and tearing apart any abomination coming close. A huge emerald flash shattered the spell, rattling the Blood Raven to the bone. He blinked off after images and saw a Necron monolith towering above the battlefield a few kilometers away. Demons fell left and right, bursting into white or silver flames. Those who survived whatever just happened stumbled and began moving much slower than before. The monolith lashed in all directions, heavy exotic weaponry laying waste upon anything it touched. "Push them back! Attack!" Captain Thule roared and threw himself back into the fry. "All units on this net, priority Alpha target Skull-Taker has been neutralized." Antaeus's tired voice came over the battle net. "We need immediate apothecary or Medicae assistance on my position. Multiple critical wounded." Thule sliced through one last bloodletter, and suddenly there were no more demons facing him. He could see traitor armor in the distance, exchanging fire with the monolith, before all kinds of Necron drones swarmed all over the vehicles. A moment later, numerous explosions lit up the horizon. It was time to take stock of the casualties and figure out the situation.